Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for joining today's webinar to discuss the tragic attack of about 36 hours ago here in Washington, D.C., in which Yaron Lashinsky and Sarah Milgram were tragically murdered in an anti-Semitic attack outside of the Capitol Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C. I'm honored to be joined by my colleague Steve Pomerantz, JINSA's Director Emeritus of our Homeland Security Program, and also the former Associate Director of the FBI, as well as Sheriff Eric Severson of Waukesha, Wisconsin. Sheriff Severson has served in the Waukesha Sheriff's Office for more than 38 years, working his way up from deputy, now serving in a supervisory role for more than 25 years. He holds 2 bachelor's degrees and is also a graduate of the FBI National Academy Class 219 in the National Sheriff's Institute, and he's also a board member of the National Sheriff's Association. And for those that are unfamiliar, JINSA's Homeland Security Program, on which, as I mentioned, Eric Severson was a participant last summer and Steve Pomerantz has directed for more than 2 decades, is an annual program that brings senior law enforcement executives from America to Israel to learn from Israeli practitioners counterterrorism strategies and best practices. And upon the return of their trips back to America, participants are connected with their local Jewish communities and leaders to build relations back home. So to discuss this terrible tragedy, I'd first turn to Steve to ask you what we know the latest about this attack and the perpetrator and what happened just 2 nights ago.
I just want to take a minute. We are here today because of a terrible tragedy. And I know that one of the reactions, a normal reaction to something like this is to offer words of comfort, to offer words of support, to wax philosophical about the state of the world. I don't do any of that. If you're looking for comfort and reassurance, you're in the wrong webinar. We have to understand what we're facing as a community, and we have to react according to the reality of the situation, not according to some preconceived way we think the world should be. We have to deal with the world as it is. Hopefully, in God's time, the world will be a better place. But right now, we have to deal with what it is, and that's what I'm here to talk about. The other thing I would say is that the one of the many truths about any situation like this is like an event like this, is that some large percentage of what you hear in the days immediately following is not right. Every news outlet is focused on getting something first before everybody else. And in my experience, and that's a long experience, and Sheriff Severson can talk about his long experience with the media, they get a lot wrong. But from what we know now, it's likely that this individual acted alone. That's not to say that he wasn't motivated by much that's in the air out there, and that he absorbed and was motivated by. But it appears that he acted alone, which is becoming an increasingly dangerous situation. I'm sure that somewhere during this hour, we'll talk about the security arrangements and the lack thereof. And again, not to sound too cynical about it, but there's a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking that goes into an analysis of a security failure. There's a lot of reality that goes into it, but by definition, this was a failure, security failure. So we'll talk about that. Over.
Thank you, Steve. And Sheriff, did this attack surprise you? I know you're based outside of Milwaukee. Did this attack surprise you? Was this different to you than the other anti-Semitic attacks and shootings that have happened, including just a few years ago at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh? Or is this similar?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer. Before we get started, I do want to express my condolences to the family and the community. This is a tragedy. this is something that law enforcement has been talking about actively, certainly at the sheriff's level for a couple of years. The involvement that the National Sheriff's Association has had with JINSA in allowing us to have these trips to Israel to talk directly to national security folks in Israel, and to talk to IDF, to talk to the border police, the national police, was very eye-opening. To Steve's point, we definitely have to look at the reality that we're facing today. I have to say that prior to my trip to Israel, I was very ignorant in terms of the challenges that the Israeli people are dealing with. So to your question, does it surprise me? 2 years ago, I would say yes. Post Israel visit that took place about this time last year, every single leader, every law enforcement officer, every opportunity that we had to talk to somebody over there told us the same thing, told me the same thing. Don't think that this isn't going to come to America. Don't think that when people are yelling death to Israel, death to Jews, that they don't mean it. And they're also yelling death to America. And it took a while for that to settle in, but all of the sheriffs that have attended this program, we have collectively got together, and we've been the beneficiary of some of the unique evidence that exists in the Israeli intelligence community that has been shared with us. And so we had an opportunity to see, for example, in brutal clarity, what happened in October. And as hard as it is to say, I'm not surprised. And I don't think a lot of law enforcement officers are surprised. That doesn't mean that we're not outraged. It doesn't mean that it's not a horrific attack. But when you're told over and over and over again that this kind of thing is happening all around the world, and it's only a matter of time, and there's plenty of evidence to show that it is traveling and manifesting itself, and the level of hate and intolerance that we're seeing, it shouldn't surprise anyone in law enforcement, and it doesn't surprise me. So I'm sorry to have to say that I really wasn't surprised. Horrified, yes. Saddened, yes, but surprised, no.
And I think you bring up a great point, which others have said before, that a lot in this community from which the suspect came from, and you see it at rallies and riots and marches since October 7th, is that this community that waves the Palestinian flags and the Hamas flags is simultaneously burning in the streets, not just Israeli flags, but also American flags, and calling for the death to America as well. And just when they protested here in Washington, D.C., and they pulled down the American flag from in front of Union Station across the Capitol, it's clear that their enemies in their mind are one and the same. So I think you make a great point on that. Now, you mentioned things that you and your colleagues are discussing to mitigate some of these threats and try to prevent them. One of the questions I have for both of you is, how, especially in today's environment, do you track the potential attackers? They post a lot on social media. They don't make their views secret, but there's tens and thousands of these people who are posting these messages on a daily basis. How do you filter out who's just speaking and writing versus who's going to commit an attack?
Eric, you want me to?
Yeah, I'd like you to start with that. That's a
well,
big deal.
You know, since 9/11, one of the obvious failures that we saw afterward when we looked at all of our systems was a failure to share intelligence. We've come a long way, but not from my, again, I'm an outsider now, so I get peeks in, and maybe Eric would characterize it differently, but my understanding is still there are gaps. We have 18,000 law enforcement agencies in this country, 18,000. And one of these attacks can happen anywhere. Doesn't have to be Washington, D.C. or New York City. We've seen that. So identifying people who pose a threat, sharing that information among 18,000 agencies is difficult. We are doing better at it than we used to, but there's always room for improvement. And let me just say something a little bit philosophically: is this is a free country, and you are entitled to express your opinion, freely. I always, and this, but I'm certain it's going to happen in this case. I'm not as certain as I can be that somebody will say, well, some news person will get on and say, well, this guy was on law enforcement's radar screen. Well, what does that mean? First of all, in law enforcement, we don't have a radar that I'm aware of. That was snippy. But what does that mean? That someone once called and said that the person is dangerous? There's very little that law enforcement can do with that, and it happens every day, thousands of times across the country. So getting information, sifting it, evaluating it, and then determining what to do about it. What do you do? And we see this in all these school shootings. We see it in all kinds of criminal cases, and we see it in this business, in the counterterrorism business. Just because a person is a little bit off, there's oftentimes not a lot that law enforcement can do. There is some occasions, sometimes, some things, but it's very, very difficult. Sheriff?
Well, Steve, I think you hit it on the head. There are a lot of things that get in the way of law enforcement's ability to be proactive in some of these instances. And to echo Steve's comments, expressing opinions that are unpopular is lawful in this country. And you can have 100 people express the same opinion that's unpopular and could be, well, I'll leave it at unpopular. But only one has any intention of taking some type of a violent or criminal action as a result of that opinion. And we have no way of sorting that out. The resources simply aren't available. Steve gave me a good idea to give a good descriptor of the challenge in school shooting kinds of environments, where in my county and in many counties around the country, there's a system in place, or there are systems in place where students know that if they see something or hear something, they need to report that to their teachers or to law enforcement. And we get a pretty significant number of reports of potential threatening behavior. And when we get that, we make that a priority, and we're gonna reach out and talk to the witnesses, and we're gonna talk to the subjects who allegedly made those comments, and we're gonna look into that. And the majority of them lead us to essentially, determining that there wasn't any veracity to the comment, or that perhaps our intervention or the fact that we just looked at it might have cooled things down. That's at a much higher level than what we're talking about here, because the internet is huge. The population that's divided on some of these issues is gigantic, and law enforcement does not have the capacity that you might see on television law enforcement shows, where there's this sense that something goes on the internet and there's a cop looking at that information and making an assessment and starting some type of law enforcement action. That's not happening. So law enforcement is in a very difficult place to try to identify somebody that's going to take action and be proactive and put a cop between the bad actor and the victim. And this recent murder or set of murders is somewhat indicative of that.
First, before I ask my next question to both of you gentlemen, I'll just invite the audience. If you have any questions for our speakers today, please use the Q&A feature on the Zoom, and we'll go ahead and ask your questions as in the order they come in. But you mentioned, Sheriff, school shootings, and one of the things that I've noticed is there's been a tremendous outpouring of support for the American Jewish community, for the families and friends and colleagues of the victims. But unlike school shootings, which often immediately are followed by calls for stricter gun control laws or other policies, I haven't heard much, if at all, in the way of policy changes that should come about after this type of attack or after many other type of anti-Semitic attacks. And so I'd like to get both of your thoughts on what type of policy changes at the federal, state, and local levels you could see that could be useful for law enforcement. And I'll just ask, for example, would creating stricter punishments that are more enforceable for lower level anti-Semitic attacks, such as the violent takeovers of buildings at Columbia University, for example, punishing those with more than a slap on the wrist, would that be more likely to prevent or mitigate this threat?
Well, I suspect, again, that the sheriff and I'll be in general agreement, if not specific. But yes, I mean, as law enforcement people, I believe 100% in enforcing the law. I made a reference to, I'm glad you gave me this opportunity because I made a reference to freedom of speech. Freedom of speech does not include harassing people. Freedom of speech on college campuses, interfering with their ability to go to school, blocking buildings. And I have to say, and I don't want to get too partisan on this, but I think what we're seeing now in terms of this administration is the right things, the things we know are necessary if we're going to secure our community. People who come to this country, who are our guests, need to behave themselves. At the very beginning of all this controversy, I think Secretary of State Rubio said it in one sentence as well as it can be said, when he said, if when they filled out their visa application, they told us what they were going to do, we wouldn't have given them a visa. And we're not trying to lock these people up in some deep, dark dungeon. We're trying to get them to go home. And the concept, the idea that they have all the legal protections of an American citizen to due process is not right. People who are in this country illegally, or people who are violating the terms of their entry into this country, and that is a big part of this problem. That led to the events, in my opinion, that led to the events of 36 hours ago. We are importing Jew hatred into this country. It's not the only reason, but we are undoubtedly importing Jew hatred into this country. And if we keep doing it, the results are predictable. Now, maybe more directly to your question, there are also prosecutive decisions, prosecutive discretion. Now, again, I point out to you that these events occur all over the country. Each of these prosecutors have independence in their judgment and charges they bring. But the idea of bringing strict charges, strong charges against people who commit these kind of acts is an appropriate, in my opinion, response. I could go on, but I'd turn over to Eric.
Yeah, sure. Are there any policies that you'd like to see changed, or legislative actions taken that would help you and your colleagues better secure against these types of attacks?
Yeah, I really agree with Steve. I mean, let's go back historically, 5 or 10 years, where this level of violence that folks want to attach to speech, wasn't an issue. And we have more laws in place today than we did 10, 15, 20 years ago. So it isn't a legislative issue. It's a cultural issue, and it's a law enforcement issue, and it's a responsibility question. To Steve's point, we went from recognizing that murder is never okay, to murder when we attach it to some type of a speech or some type of an argument, it might be okay. Or arson is really speech, or vandalism is speech, or battery is speech, or assault on police officers is speech. None of that's true. That's not speech. But folks are going to say, well, I'm really angry about my issue, so it justifies violence, it justifies destruction, it justifies lawbreaking. And that's never been allowed. If you allow it, a very wise person once told me, what you permit, you promote. And when we permit people to confuse violence with speech, or murder with speech, or property destruction or assault with speech, then we're promoting unlawful behavior, and we're wrapping it all up in the protection of speech. And that's not what the law says. It's not what the Constitution supports. It's not what our country believes in. And law enforcement is frustrated when we turn a blind eye to the law breaking and excuse it because it's somehow connected with speech. And so I'm less enthusiastic about policy changes as I am about direct accountability, and the country and law enforcement and the judicial system taking back the sense that the judiciary and the criminal justice system is about public safety and right and wrong. And if we can get back to that, I think we're going to get away from people clothing unlawful behavior in some protection of speech.
Leo, I want to say that in the recording of this, take a clip of what he just said, and it's every word he said is true and accurate, and it sort of, one of the things that politicians always do in light of some of these things is ask the question you asked: what policy do we need? What new policy? We need to do what the sheriff just said, and that will take us a long, long way. We have laws against these kinds of things. We just need to enforce them.
I think I definitely agree with all that. I think one thing, and I know we're living in an era of Doge and budget cuts, but I think one thing that could be useful, especially at a time like this, is if for the nonprofit security grant program that's been designated through the Department of Homeland Security to support Jewish institutions with government aid for security upgrades at their buildings, I think it would be very useful at a time like this for that program to significantly expand the funds that are available to it, to change the rubric and scoring system that understandably prioritizes synagogues and Jewish schools, but understanding that the threat has grown far wider, and make it easier and faster for other Jewish institutions to significantly increase their security, because we know that attacks do happen. It takes time for law enforcement and first responders to get there. And there's a tremendous amount of vulnerabilities today that could be addressed with additional resources. Sheriff, and this specifically for you, but also Steve, because you've dealt with hundreds of law enforcement executives that JINSA has brought to Israel over the years. What is the best way for local Jewish communities to work with their local law enforcement agencies to make sure that they're safe?
It's a great question, Leo. I think, and this just doesn't, it's not limited to the Jewish community. It's every community. We have to start with a conversation. We have to build relationships. And to your earlier point, threat assessment is a big part of what law enforcement does. We're living in a very different world than we were 15, 20 years ago. And we have to acknowledge that the threats are different. Those of us that went to Israel, not just my group, but my predecessor groups, we all came back with a greater appreciation of the vulnerabilities of our communities. So we need to look at those vulnerabilities and have conversations and try to figure out, can we address those vulnerabilities with the resources that we have? If not, how do we increase our resources? How do we better prepare ourselves to deal with what appears to be an inevitable elevation of that threat? So, as an example, I've got a very good friend of mine who's a sheriff in a very, very large state, who texted me a few minutes ago and said, "Hey, I'm going to be sending my tactical team to Israel so that we can get a better awareness, get more training, make ourselves better prepared to deal with some of these elevated threat situations." Now, not every sheriff can do that. We have sheriffs in this country that only have a few deputies working in their county, so that's going to be difficult. And we have sheriff's offices and police departments and local constables and state police, and we've got a lot of different levels and overlapping law enforcement that needs to kind of all get on the same page, recognize these threats, and then have these conversations within the target community. And it isn't just the Israeli community; it's all of our communities, and we have to look at all of these different threats that are there. And I'll go back to my point that when we have half of the country scream in one direction and the other half scream in the other, it makes it very difficult for law enforcement to establish our plan. And but it's incumbent on us to be educated. It's incumbent upon us to look at what's happening around us, from immigration problems, from the prospective terrorist threats that we're facing. I mean, there's just a lot that's going on that rises to these horrific crimes.
Leo,
Yeah.
let me add something to that. When we started this law enforcement, the Homeland Security program 25 years ago, the first couple of trips were focused like laser beams on providing American law enforcement executives with specific knowledge on how to deal with counterterrorism threats in their communities. It became apparent after a couple of these that they were seeing things and hearing about things that in many cases was new to them. The specific concerns of the Jewish communities in their jurisdictions, a specific concern about the worldwide Jewish community to threats and violence against Jews. And they came back and many of them initially on their own, reached out to the leadership in their Jewish communities and did set out to establish relationships and to provide assistance where they could. That has become, to be perfectly honest, maybe today a more important goal of the program, because American law enforcement has come a long way in counterterrorism techniques and protocols. But so your question, the simple answer to your question is establishing relationships between the Jewish community and its institutions and local law enforcement. To be honest with you, I've been involved in some of those efforts, and no one has ever come back to me, no one, and said, "Gee, the law enforcement community was not very responsive to us." That has not happened. Sheriff Severson and almost all of his colleagues, how could you not be aware of the specific threat today? This group wouldn't have be talking today. They are aware of it. They want to help, and that's the communications issue and the relationships are the most important thing.
If I could just add too that we're talking about anti-Semitism and the safety of the Jewish community today. I mean, I'm in southeastern Wisconsin, and in my career, I've had a church mass shooting in my county. It wasn't a Jewish synagogue. We had a a shooting in a neighboring county at a Sikh temple, which was a horrific shooting. So our actual experience is that this isn't solely focused on just the Jewish community, even though this conversation is started by this recent murder. But law enforcement has this bigger objective that we're trying to provide safety in all gatherings. We're trying to provide safety in our community. And it's important that the community recognize that we all have to take some responsibility in providing awareness to these threats. And, and I keep going back to the threat awareness. We can no longer stick our head in the sand and say, this is not going to happen in Waukesha County. It's not going to happen, because it has happened in Waukesha County. And we can't say it's not going to happen in Wisconsin, because it happens in Wisconsin. And it's going to happen in Texas and Idaho and Florida. And right now we're talking about the District of Columbia. And there's a lot of targets in DC. We have embassies there. We have elected officials and judiciary. It's a very target-rich environment. And that's what we're talking about today from a geography and a jurisdictional standpoint. But that doesn't mean that these threats aren't all over the country. And the sheriffs are keenly aware of this. And those of us that have had the privilege of, again, being able to go back to Israel to learn about the best practices in a community where this kind of thing has been going on for decades, arguably for centuries. We need to pay attention. We in law enforcement need to pay attention. When your neighbor tells you every day that they're going to punch you in the mouth, you shouldn't be surprised that today you get punched in the mouth. And we need to have this awakening, and we need to recognize that this acceptance of violence, this attachment of violence as being okay because it's connected with some type of a valued speech, it's preposterous. And it's offensive to anyone that wants to live in a safe community.
Could I ask you to follow up on what you said? Were there any specific departmental changes that you made or that your other trip participants made that you're aware of after your trip to Israel? Or Steve, if you know of any other alumni things that they've done concretely, having learned from the Israelis to strengthen.
Yeah. I'll take a swing at that. The observations that we did on our post October 7th trips, I think there have been 4 of them till now, we really immersed ourselves into the events of that day. We were in the South, we were in Sderot, we were close to the border, we went to the affected kibbutzim, we saw it up close and personal, and one of the strongest messages for law enforcement people was what happened on that day to law enforcement. They lost almost 60 officers. They were the first responders. That's what the motto is. And they heroically, in many cases, armed only with their sidearms, took on terrorists. And they were successful in keeping the terrorists from penetrating further into Israel, which was clearly their intention. And they were successful in that. So one of the obvious, lessons was they were just unprepared for as a law enforcement organization to deal with the sudden, massive attack that they face now. If you look at the U.S., I mean, it'd be hard to conjure up a scenario that really aligns with what happened on October 7th. However, it's not, based on our experience in this country, that a similar, or maybe on a smaller scale, kind of attack like that would take place, particularly given the past situation on the border importation of criminal gangs into our country. So the sheriffs really looked at that and started, what can we do to train our people, equip our people? Again, most of those police officers in Israel went into combat, because that's what it was, with their 9mm sidearms, in the exact same way that most law enforcement officers in this country go on about their duties armed only with their sidearm and then one extra or two extra magazines. And I know that, and Sheriff Severson just made reference, and I'm always making reference to the follow-up visit by a particular sheriff's department to deal specifically with those kind of issues. So that was one of the lessons of Eric. Whatever else?
Yeah, I'm very proud to tell you that law enforcement has embraced this event and the training opportunities that bring with it. So we've had, at the National Sheriff's Association, we've had an opportunity to watch a video compilation of videos that the Israeli intelligence service had put together regarding the attack in Israel. It's not available for the general public to see. So there's countless lessons that can be gleaned from watching what happened. And to Steve's point, we have a hard time envisioning such a similar event happening in the United States, but it really shouldn't be, because 20 or so individuals took down the Twin Towers and attacked the Pentagon and downed an airliner. So we shouldn't be surprised to think that a small group of people can inflict great terror within the boundaries of our borders. So as the nation's sheriffs look at the evidence of what happened in Israel, and those of us that had the privilege of being able to go there and talk directly to the policymakers and the law enforcement and the military and the intelligence people, and then we come back to the United States and all of us ask the same question. I know I asked it. So what do I do with this? What do I take from this experience, and how do I make my community safer? And so the kinds of things that I did and the kinds of things that I'm seeing throughout the country with our nation's sheriffs is it starts with training their staff on what happened and sharing the lessons that we learned. And from there, sheriffs are looking at their own capabilities from an equipment standpoint, from a training standpoint, from an operational standpoint, and trying to do an assessment on, what do we do well? What are our shortcomings? What do we need? How do we change our mindset from just one or two officers or deputies going to a call and then dealing with whatever's in front of us, versus how do we anticipate when things get really bad really fast, and how are we going to respond? And that requires a different outlook on how we establish command. It's a training challenge. It's a staffing challenge. It's a tactical challenge. There's a lot of things, and I'm not going to go into tactics here. I don't know who's all on the call. But there are a lot of things the sheriffs are doing around the country to try to assimilate the knowledge that we've taken and ask the question, what are we going to do when bad things like this are going to happen? And again, we may not be able to foresee 10,000 people crossing the border and attacking our country, but we sure as well better be able to see that 20 or 30 people can murder thousands and thousands of Americans, because we've seen it happen. And we know it's something that's on the minds of our enemies every day. So let's stop ignoring the fact that people are saying, I want to punch you in the face. Expect that if somebody says they're going to punch you in the face over and over and over again, they're going to do it. And when they say death to America countless times, daily, hourly, don't be surprised when terrible, terrible things happen within the borders of our country. And so law enforcement's challenge is to try to figure out our best way to address that.
We've got, I know our time is coming up short here, but we've got two questions from the audience that I'd like to ask kind of rapid fire for both of you. The first is, are you aware of any improvements in law enforcement's ability to, that in recent achievements of preventing anti-Semitic attacks like this? We read often about prevented school shootings or other mass casualty attacks, but have you seen anything specifically on this? And then also, another guest asks if you can analyze the security preparations and performance of security at the museum event, because the shooter was reportedly wandering around the museum during the event in full view of security. And should they have interdicted him and questioned him until the event was cleared?
Eric, do you want to?
Sure. The first question, am I aware of something specific? No. We're utilizing the same threat assessment and intelligence gathering that we always have. And again, it's rare that the actual operators on these kinds of attacks are going to necessarily announce their intentions. They may behave in certain ways. They may post offensive things on social media, but oftentimes that doesn't rise to the attention of law enforcement. As far as the security shortfalls, if there were any, I don't think we know enough about what was going on there. Again, in Washington, it's probably, from the 50 or so times I've been in Washington, Steve spent a lot more time there than I have. It's got one of the most densely enforced area that I've ever been in. I mean, there's more uniformed police in DC than I think most places in the country. And then you add on top of that the various private security forces that exist for museums and buildings that are in DC. I mean, there's a lot of cops there. There's a lot of law enforcement. And my guess is that, again, it's not unlawful to loiter in front of loiter isn't the right word. It's not unlawful to be spending time on a sidewalk in front of a public building. So I don't know what they did or didn't do yet. A lot's going to be determined by waiting for these investigations. To Steve's point, we need to wait a little bit. We need to give law enforcement an opportunity. Donald Rumsfeld famously said, "We don't know what we don't know." It's going to take a little bit of time to figure out what those security measures were, and if in fact there might have been some failures. So it's tough to prevent evil. It's very difficult to prevent evil.
Leo, I would say, to the question of security, I knew it would come up, and we don't have time to talk about the issues of physical security for Jewish institutions. I mean, there have been, and I'm involved with this issue on a pretty much of a daily basis. The one thing you can say, I mean, as cynical as it may sound, is that whatever arrangements they had, wasn't enough. I mean, it failed, but by definition. What the level of security should have been, again, that's we're going to operate in the context of 2020 hindsight. I know they had some security arrangements. I've become accustomed to being invited to a Jewish event and not being told what the address is until 24 hours before the event. My wife got up in absolute, almost state of physical rebellion to one of the events we went to that said no purses, you could carry nothing into the venue, including women's small purses. So the Jewish community is responding to the need for physical security. I have personalized this. I have grandchildren who go to a Hebrew school at our synagogue, and every time I drive up there to pick one of them up, I see what I consider to be security lapses. I bring it to the attention of people. Sometimes I prevail, sometimes I don't. It is a very, very difficult issue. It is being addressed. There are organizations that are specifically devoted to Jewish security issues. There are money available, as has been pointed out previously. All that's good, but we've got to do. If you're relying on in the end on physical security as your primary means of defending yourself, you've essentially capitulated. We've got to address this at the front end more than we have. It'll be more productive.
Thank you very much, Steve and Sheriff Severson, for your comments. In closing, I would just like to say, and Sheriff, I'm glad you mentioned your colleague that texted you. And I know we have other law enforcement executives and sheriffs on this call right now. JINSA would be delighted to work with you to bring your departments to Israel, or to bring you as an individual to Israel through our Homeland Security program. So please be in touch with JINSA directly to arrange that. And I thank all of our guests for their time this morning, in particular JINSA's national leaders. And I encourage you, if you're not yet a supporter, if you're already a supporter, consider increasing your investment in JINSA, in particular now our Homeland Security program that's already educated more than 11,000 American law enforcement officers through trips to Israel and domestic conferences. I think at the time and the need is greater now than ever before, unfortunately. And as we enter the weekend, I know Yaron Lashinsky and Sarah Milgram, and all, may they be of blessed memory. We keep their friends, their families, and colleagues all in our hearts and minds. And may we come out from this with a resolve and unity to confront these many issues that Steve and Sheriff Severson discussed today. Thank you all again for your time, and have a great weekend.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Eric?
Yes, sir.